850. Ian Dale at Drive on LBC.
Hello, a very good evening. It is 5 minutes past 5 here on LBC. You are listening to Ian Dale at Drive. Let me tell you what's coming up a little bit later in the show. At 6, we're going to be talking to the Education Secretary, Michael Gove. I might play that clip from PMQs to him. I'm sure he won't mind, really. And then a lot later, at 7, we have the Deputy Leader of the Labour Party, Harriet Harman, joining me in the studio. She is going to be taking your calls. We'll also be joined in the studio later by Lord Ashcroft. He's written a very important report today on the future of our veterans, so we'll be talking to him about that. But if you want to call Harriet Harman, the number to call 0845 6060 973. But first, we are going to continue talking about floods. So if you've just joined us, we were just listening to the Prime Minister there live in Downing Street giving a press conference explaining that he is very much in charge. The message, according to Chris Shipp from ITV News, was, "I am on this." Andrew Mitchell joins me in the studio, former Cabinet Minister. Andrew, you and I remember back in 2007, we were both in Rwanda when there were summer floods affecting David Cameron's constituency. And a lot of people thought that he shouldn't have made the trip to Rwanda. Well, maybe he's learned his lesson from that.
Well, of course, we were then in opposition and not in government. But I think from the press conference he's just given, you can see that the smack of firm government on this issue is very much there. He is totally gripping what is required. And, these floods are simply awful. We all know people whose lives have been turned upside down by the floods. And it's extremely important that the government does everything it can to help the poor people who are caught in this way.
Now, the reason that I asked you to come in today was because I was lying in bed this morning listening to Nick Ferrari at breakfast, and he had Nigel Farage on, and they were talking about the floods, and Nigel Farage was making the point, which my colleague Nick Ferrari agreed with, that if it wasn't for all this foreign aid, we could actually give money to flood victims to help them back on their feet. And I lay there thinking, this is just wrong. It's not right to say that. It's not a choice of one or the other. If we want to give money to flood victims, and I'm sure we should in many ways, and David Cameron made that point just now. If we want to do that, there is a contingency fund, a reserve fund that the government has for this sort of thing. So to raise this argument is completely fatuous.
Well, I think you summed it up extremely well. I completely agree.
You can go now, then.
I completely agree with what you said. I mean, first of all, it is not an either or. It's not a question of we can't find this money and therefore we've got to take it from another budget. The Prime Minister has made clear today, indeed he made it clear at the end of last week, that money would be no object. We've got to get on top of this dreadful flood situation and the money will be found. It's not a question of either or, and the fact is that British aid every day saves lives. It's been transformed by this government, made far more effective so that we can look the taxpayer in the eye and say that for every pound of your hard-earned taxes we spend on overseas aid, we are really getting 100 pence of value on the ground.
And I should have explained before, you were International Development Secretary for the first, two and a half years of this government. That's why you've got a relevant view on this.
Yes, I was the opposition spokesman for 5 years, so I had a chance to work out how British aid needed to be changed to improve it and deal with some of the perfectly legitimate concerns and issues that people have. And then I had 2.5 years as the Development Secretary implementing those changes. And, the changes underline the fact that this isn't only support and aid from Britain. It benefits Britain hugely in terms of our future prosperity, the peace and security. A lot of British aid money is spent making Britain more secure, as well as making parts of the world which are deeply dysfunctional more secure as well.
One of the points Nigel Farage was making to Nick Ferrari was that Germany, which is in many ways a far more successful economy than ours, they don't give anywhere near the levels of aid that we do. Is that something that we should be proud of, or is there room for a slight constraint in our aid spending?
Well, that is not actually correct. If you look at the defined aid that Germany gives and that France gives and that Britain gives, we do give more, but it's pretty marginal amount. And we made a promise in Britain, as did other countries, to the poorest people in the world, that we would increase our spending to 0.7 1%, in other words, under 1% of our national income. And Britain has stood by that promise. And I'm personally very proud to have served in a government which didn't balance the books on the backs of the poorest people in the world, but stuck by its promise, even in these very difficult times of austerity in Britain.
Just give me one example of something that when you were International Development Secretary, you visited a project in a poor country and you thought, well, if the British taxpayer could come and see this, all of them, they wouldn't have the attitudes that maybe we shall hear later on in the hour from some of our callers, I'm sure.
Well, let me give you just one example of that. Throughout the course of this Parliament, the 5 years of this Parliament, British aid will vaccinate a child in the poorest parts of the world every 2 seconds and save the life of a child every 2 minutes throughout the whole of this Parliament from diseases that none of our children in Britain die from. And I think that's something which every citizen of Britain can be proud. That's Britain's contribution to some of the poorest and most wretched children in the world.
Now, it's about the country you want to be, really, isn't it? I mean, we can all be an insular country. We can all say sort of the rest of the world can go hang. But actually, most of us, I would like to think most of us wouldn't want that to be the case. Now, if you're listening to Andrew Mitchell, you think, what a nice voice he has. You can actually watch him as well. If you go to lbc.co.uk, we have switched the webcam on. Lord Smith. Lord Chris Smith, former Labour Cabinet Minister, he's come in for a bit of a hammering over the past couple of days, not least from some of your colleagues. Is the criticism fair? He's head of the Environment Agency, for those not in the know.
I think the criticism of Lord Smith is extremely ill-advised. He was appointed by a Conservative Secretary of State. He's a very experienced politician. And really, for him to be attacked at a time when he's got to be absolutely on the case, doing his very best, I think is pretty outrageous. And it seems to me it's a sort of short change of politics for people to brief against him behind his hand. We need to support him in the very important work that he now needs to do to help all those who've been caught up in this.
So you're putting Eric Pickles back in his box or back in his crate?
Well, I think that I'm not sure what and whether Eric Pickles needs to be put back anywhere. It's quite a task, but the fact is that we need to back the head of the Environment Agency to do the best possible job he can for these people who are caught in this way. Now,
if the victims of the floods haven't been through enough, they've now been deluged by something worse, a plague of politicians visiting them in the southwest. Will you be donning your waders anytime soon?
Well, thankfully, my constituency is mercifully flood-free, although we do have some small localised problems, and we're very conscious of our good fortune in contrast to those who've been caught up in the southwest.
But isn't this a case of where politicians are damned if they do and damned if they don't? If they don't go and visit, people accuse them of not caring, and if they do, people say, "Oh, well, just stay away. You're sort of getting in the way."
I think what people will really respect is the fact that the Prime Minister went down today. He's been staying overnight last night. He's come back to London. He's announced firm action. They can hear the smack of firm government coming to ensure that these problems are addressed and addressed fully. And I think that's the sort of political activity which will win praise and support from those who are caught up.
We've had the Prime Minister, Nick Clegg, Nigel Farage, Ed Miliband, all sort of visiting various flood areas today. Do you think sometimes politicians do this because they feel they have to, rather than because they think it's necessary?
I think that we should give people the benefit of the doubt on this. The politicians you mentioned have gone today to see what needs to be done. All of them, I think, have gone to see what needs to be done to help in these very difficult circumstances. And of course, it is the Prime Minister who has the power to effect action, as he's doing right at this moment. But it's for the other politicians, the opposition and so forth, to hold us to account and to hold the Prime Minister to account for the effectiveness of what he is doing.
Now, finally, can't let you go without asking you about what happened last week, the sentencing of PC Keith Wallace. Did that mark sort of a line in the sand for you?
Well, I think it's all extremely sad. We need to move on from all of this. So in that sense, I think that is certainly right. But I think we also need to make sure that the relevant lessons are learned. We do need some reforms of the institutions involved in all of this. And we need to make sure that it can't happen to anyone else. And the point I have always made is that if it can happen to a cabinet minister, it can happen to anyone, anywhere, at any time. On that less than positive note, we'll let you go, Andrew. Thank you very much indeed for coming in. Thank you, Ian.
You're listening to LBC 97.3. If you'd like to give me a call and give me your views on whether you think that I'm right on international aid and flood money, and that Nigel Farage is raising a man of straw with the argument that foreign aid should be used for flood victims. 0845 6060 973.